So I'm going to assume most of you have heard the word ecology and know maybe something about it, but as James said, this is a very quick review or overview of some of the main principles of ecology, but there's lots of pictures, so don't worry too much about too much material. I'm going to divide it into four main sections. So first of all, just a reminder, what's biodiversity and ecology? Just a quick reminder of those terms. We use scales in ecology. So you look at an insect, you look at a flower, or you look at the wider picture. So again, just putting that in context for you, that infamous phrase, ecosystem services, you've probably all come across that, have you? Sort of, maybe. It's not day-to-day use, and it doesn't mean a lot to people, but it's actually what we're measuring as part of the acre scoring system. And very quickly, key principles of ecology, which your reading material is going to go into that in more detail. And it's a really nice, user-friendly piece of material that's going to be up for this. So do read it through. There are 10 questions based on that. And again, as James said, anybody who's read through that will quickly be able to answer those. That's biodiversity, isn't it? Yeah. So not as colourful as mine is here, but the colours are amazing. That's taken from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And again, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that, but it underpins a lot of what we do. Around 1992, the world kind of woke up to its understanding that we're in deep trouble. And they brought everybody together in Rio, and they figured that we have to change things. So they signed this Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a voluntary agreement that pretty much every nation on Earth signs up to. And it says, we will do more for our ecosystems. We will work better. And a lot of the work we're doing is actually directly underpinned from that. And that's what they have up. So I put that up for students and I go, that's biodiversity, isn't it? And they go, yeah. Those are all from Leitrim. Those are all with my camera, my phone camera. I could feel that 15 times over. When I was doing the results-based scheme scoring system, and I was out trying to figure out what plants would tell us the story of different grasslands, I just had my phone or my camera with me, taking pictures of everything I saw. And that's just in Leitrim grasslands. That's just some of the range of biodiversity you can find. And most of the time that's hidden to people. So the farmers see the rushes and they don't see the other things that are living beside the rushes. So I would actually bring along some pictures with me just to show them things they hadn't seen when they're going around their day-to-day work. And I would explain to them, that's the biodiversity we're trying to pay you for. But biodiversity is a meaningful phrase. So the Convention on Biological Diversity tells us it's this. It's species, genetics, and ecosystems. We generally operate at the species level. So I'm going to get you up to speed on looking at plant species. You're going to learn plant species. If you get down to it, actually defining species can be quite difficult, defining what a species is. But we're not going to get into that. We're not going to go as far as genetic diversity, but if you maintain ecosystems in good condition, you've got a fair chance of keeping all the genetic diversity that's going to be important there as well. That's going to be particularly meaningful when climate change hits us. And the more genetic diversity we have, the more chance some things have of surviving that. And then ecosystems, how many things do we have interacting together that give space for plants and animals? So all of those three things add up together to be biodiversity. But we're looking at one element in this course really, which is the plants. But you might ask, how much biodiversity? I think only 2 million plus species have been described by science, which is a very small amount. And I've severe hopes that one day a plant will be named after me that I'll have found in Leitrim that has never been found before. But most of the things that we spend our time identifying, they're only a small proportion of the biodiversity that we actually have. So we were all hit by COVID there a few years ago. That's part of biodiversity. Lots of things that we've never known about. And in fact, I think a few years ago, somebody was doing soil sampling in Fermanagh and they'd found a new bacteria that it was new to science. Literally, in Ireland, we don't know how many species we have. We don't know how many species we have in Ireland. And we've got lots of people looking at this. So again, we know a lot, we don't know other bits and pieces, but only 1% of the total species on the planet Earth that have ever existed are here now. And we are doing a good job of getting rid of a lot of that 1% at the moment. So this is why acres is really important. It's about using what we have here to show people how well they're doing or how we could do a little bit better. Categories, so we like categorizing things. So we're going to concentrate really on this above ground biodiversity. Tends to be the one that we're going to bring you through in a W or in a way of walking, and we're going to be able to identify it. It doesn't run away from us, plants. But there's other things like soil biodiversity. So if we were to get you to look at that, that's years and years and years of research to try and figure out what one earthworm is compared to another. Heather and Emma are experts in aquatic biodiversity, and none of us are experts in bacteria, viruses, but a lot of that goes hand in hand with the ecosystems that we look at. There's a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of decomposition and recycling and nutrient processes that goes on by that hidden biodiversity. So ecology, just a quick reminder, so there's a cow, and the cow's in the field, it's part of biodiversity as well. And the cow is indirectly having an impact on the environment around them. So directly, they are changing the structure of that grassland, what plants grow there, what plants don't want to grow there. Their nutrient inputs are forming a new type of ecosystem. So the cow patch with all the little fungi and bacteria and dung beetles that are growing there, directly there, they're having an impact on whether things can flower and set seed, what time of year, you know all of this already. And indirectly, they're having an impact on the water quality surrounding us. So ecology just means, it's a phrase that says, how do we look at all of that together? How's that all interacting together? Scales of organization. So has anybody ever come across the marsupial butterfly? No? Okay, that's my marsupial butterfly on my land. And hopefully I wouldn't see just one, because if I saw just one, it's like that poor Galapagos tortoise, whatever it is, Lonesome George or whatever, you'd be the only one left. You don't want that. You want them to be able to reproduce and to have the next population going. So we look at individuals and we look to see what the population is doing. That gives us insight into how ecology is doing. But if I see marsh faturi, I see that scene in the background. Now, what James was saying about good and bad land, the farmer that I took that picture in, he said to me this was his bad land. So he said to me, I would never be confident enough to enter that into an agri-environment scheme because I wouldn't be confident that that would meet the criteria. So again, it just mattered. The message we send out matters. So he is producing marsh faturi butterfly by the bucket load. In fact, he had the best population in Leitrim, I would say. But the service or what we're paying them for wasn't based on that product. So again, scales of organisation, we have the individual, we have the population. In order for them to be there, they have to have the resources or they have to have the habitat. So there's your habitat. So what do you need? Well, you need this. You need, if you're a butterfly or a pollinator, marsh faturi are pollinators. So they need places where they can go and they can collect nectar. But you're never going to see an adult butterfly with that plant together because actually that plant is used by the larvae. So when the female comes out, she's very heavy. She can only fly about 250 meters. She needs that plant, that purple plant. Does anybody know the name of it actually? Devil's Bit scabious. You've already passed the course, well done. She needs lots of Devil's Bit scabious because that's where she lays the eggs. And then when the larvae hatch out, they eat that plant. And you need it in large densities. You also need the management. So if you're mowing that land, that's not going to have the marsh faturi on it generally. You need it grazed and generally grazed by cattle, sometimes ponies or horses as well. And you need a little bit of sunshine and not so horrible weather because they do respond quite naturally to fluctuations in weather as well. So naturally they'll have what's called boom and bust populations, high population, low population, high population, low population. And it's nothing to do with what the farmer is doing. It's to do with their inherent natural population processes. So this is why ecology sounds simple, gets complicated, but I wanted to take a species just to give you an insight into it. But if I see marsh faturi butterfly in a location, I know that the habitat is there, but I also know that there's a community. So things that are associated with that species that are present as well. And there's lots of different butterflies, birds, worms. Generally, everything that we'd like to see there is in good condition. So again, remember the farmers telling me bad land, I'm seeing it as good land because it's got all the community of species that I would like to find there and expect to find there. So interactions in ecology are really important. So you've probably all drawn the traditional food web. The kids do that in schools. And you can have a negative interaction. So something negates something else. The interaction between them isn't mutually beneficial. You can have interactions that benefit each other, or they literally exist and they don't really interact. It doesn't make any difference. But when we look at ecology, we're trying to figure out what are the main types of interactions and how can we figure out if we change something like grazing or the type of grazer, what impact would that have on, say, marsh artillery? So inter and intraspecific species interactions. So again, think about your butterflies. So marsh artillery are a population, and like any population, they're competing with each other for space and those flowers that they'd like to get the nectar from, and they're competing for resources, and they're also competing for the leaves of that devil's bit scabious. So that's their interspecific, so between individuals of the same population. And then more widely in the field, the butterfly, marsh artillery butterfly, is competing with other butterflies that are around at the same time for those resources, and plants there competing with each other for nutrients and space and pollinators and other things. So co-evolution is the phrase that we'd use for students. So you can get things that co-evolve together to exploit the same type of habitat, and other things that are not interested in that habitat. So generally when you see marsh artillery, it's not in nicely drained soils, it's in wet soils. So there's certain types of things that go hand in hand with that. Does this look like your type of landscape that you, yeah? This is my type of landscape. You can't really see it well, but it's a real hodgepodge mix of habitats. So what have we got? Ecosystems we tend to group together. So we like to categorize. So blanket bog and heath, semi-natural woodland, semi-natural grassland, plantation woodland. We've got some one-off housing there. We've got some bits of scrub. Those are hedgerows that have just basically started leaning into the grassland next door. So at a landscape level, all of these things are interacting with each other. And that's really important for marsh artillery butterfly. I'll tell you why in a second. Because when you're a marsh artillery butterfly, you don't like one field. You don't even like just two fields. What you want is you want those habitat patches of all of that devil's bit scabious. And you want it together. And some places provide you lots of it, and they're your source sites. And some places provide you a little bit of it, and they're your sink sites. And in ecology terms, this is what's called a metapopulation. So when we think of metapopulation, we think the source sites are used every single year. They have to be really good condition. If something happens those, that's your big X through the population of marsh artillery butterfly in that year. The sink sites are ones that are only used, say, every so often. If the population gets to be such a nice, good number that they can actually immigrate out and find another location, those are those smaller areas that are going to be used. But you need all of those in use together or available to the butterflies in order to keep the population going. So that's why when we were doing the ORBAP scheme, we were thinking about results-based schemes for something like a pollinator like this that would need that landscape approach, which is why more farmers working together in these type of landscapes give marsh artillery a better chance of surviving. There's marsh artillery butterfly, and again, these are sort of semi-hazy pictures I've been taking, all different types of insects that are actually associated with this type of landscape. The little phrase we use, there's different phrases that you use for biodiversity indicators, but we'll use the phrase umbrella species for marsh artillery. You just have to see marsh artillery to understand it's like the spokes of an umbrella. Underneath that are all these other species. You don't need to go measure them. You don't need to go see that they're there. But as soon as you see marsh artillery, you know that all of them are in that location. There's also something called a keystone species. So there's your bridge and there's your keystone. And if you take that out, you wouldn't want to be going over that in your car. In some locations, in some types of habitats, a species is so important that if you take it out, the whole system collapses. Earthworms, in fairness, would be an example of keystone species. They're not quite as attractive as marsh artillery. But again, we've different ways with different phrases of explaining the importance of biodiversity and elements of biodiversity in ecosystems. And you'll hear me talk about that as we go through the indicators and helping you identify them. Spatial scale is really important. So I showed you species and I showed you small grassland. And then I showed you the landscape where the population responds. And then kind of working throughout the whole of the west coast of Ireland, we've got all of this big ecosystem response. How are things managing along that bigger scale? So again, acres, lots of farmers coming on board. We've got a chance to influence kind of what's going to happen at biodiversity level across that larger scale. Would you have heard of the phrase natural capital assets at all? I hate the terminology, in fairness, but things like this. So it's non-living things like the wind and light and energy that comes from the sun, or things that you might exploit if you'd see sand or gravel. And it's also things that are alive. So forestry, plants, trees, livestock, grasses that are growing, the earthworms that are in the soil. So these are natural capital assets. These are things that nature has that we use for something. And the ones that I've just highlighted there, they're biodiversity-based natural capital assets. So if you think about it, natural capital assets underpin actually everything. The biscuits we're going to eat, the cups of tea, everything is from nature. And what that does then, and again, the terminology is sometimes a little bit difficult, but they flow into something called ecosystem services. And there's the four main ways of thinking about ecosystem services. So we provide food for ourselves. We support ecosystems by having nutrient recycling. We regulate the climate and we regulate what happens by having pollinators. And somebody can go out into that beautiful marsh tillery field and they can feel happy, or they could paint it, and that's cultural services. So again, it's just about ways of categorizing these. These are information tools. And there's all the benefits that humans get. So we can get a healthy heart from going for a walk with nature, or we can get clean water. And then somewhere down the line, we tend to want to put a value on it. How much is that going to cost us to provide, or how much is that giving us in terms of finances back into our pockets? Just give you an example. There's Ireland, I think. And there is High Nature Valley farming system in the west of Ireland. So it's a pasture-based system. This is a land farm I went up to. I was taken up there by the National Parks and Wildlife Ranger. So when we're talking about the scoring system, James said it goes from a 1 to a 10 or a 0 to a 10. I need to find a 10 out of 10 first of all, so I could work my way back to figuring out what was the changes. And I talked to the National Parks and Wildlife Ranger, John Matthews, and he went, come to this farm. This is a 10 out of 10. If this isn't a 10 out of 10, nobody is a 10 out of 10. So we hopped up there, and sure enough, as a plant ecologist, botanist, ecologist, it was everything I could have hoped for from wet, Cavan, Leitrim soils. And it was really high in biodiversity and low amounts of livestock, as you would expect, in fairness. And this is what it looked like. So you've got that lovely mix of all of those ecosystems happening together. And there's the livestock. And so when I was trying to think of how to present this to you, this is the best way I can think about doing it. So flows of kind of services from those natural capital assets. If you've got low potential for flow, that's the bottom yellow one. Then the orange coloured one, that's medium flow. And then the purpley coloured is the good flow. So species-rich grassland, this is going to give it to me. All the species I'd like to find are living in there. Soil biodiversity, I know if I'm finding that land in good condition with all the bioindicators that I'd like to see, the soil is in pretty good condition. Water is also going to benefit from having, buffers in place. There's lots of hedges there to keep nutrients from reaching the water. If you look around that landscape, there's going to be lots of wind farms. So, okay, so far those natural capital assets are all good. Forestry, we have semi-natural forests and also got plantation forests. They grow. We have to think about, I suppose, what's going to be positioned in the right location, in the best location in these areas. Livestock, so you talk to any farmer along there, they're not going to have many livestock on that type of land. And again, something John Matthews said to me was, look at how carefully and the farmer managed that land. There is no poaching on that land. So that's really hard to achieve on that type of landscape, on that type of wet soil. And in fairness, she is a genius. It was in really good condition, but she's doing that by reducing down the amount of livestock. Stuff for a landscape to provide. So again, at the bottom there, you can't see it very well, but they're kind of color coded into the 4 different categories of ecosystem services. At the moment, only 2 of those are valued by our existing markets. So this is where, when I went along and somebody's there going, you're going to pay me for a butterfly. You're going to pay me for a butterfly. Well, it wasn't me paying them, but we were trialing how to pay them for a butterfly. We're now extending the market that they have available to them. So very finally, just some principles. So this again, this is the land in Leitrim that had the best marsh tillery source area. When you pick, we're going to talk to you about habitat classification, identification. You walk in there with your habitat classification, you go, I can't classify this. It's a mixture of everything. And again, you can't see it very well. We did take, who was it, James? The head of the EEC, Nature Conservation, what was his name? Pedro Delgado Rosa in here, and with lovely clean wellies. And, you know, this type of landscape is like nectar to Europe. This is the type of landscape that's disappearing left, right and centre. But maintaining habitat is essential for keeping that biodiversity going. Like I said to you, if you think about the marsh tillery butterfly, more is better. And now think about the marsh tillery butterfly and all the things that are associated with it. To keep those connections going, we need to keep the habitat in the right condition, optimally managed. And the disturbances that shape this community is grazing by small amount of livestock. And what's beyond us, I suppose, is thinking about climate, but anything we do on this land to keep that system in good condition helps us with our efforts towards climate. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through ecological principles. Please, when you get to the CPD online, you'll have a little document to read a little bit more background on that, but that just puts it in an Irish context and a West of Ireland context for you. Okay.
So basically what we want to do with this section at the very start is Dolores has introduced you to an awful lot of new terminology. We've gone through everything from the scale of organisation, from species, populations, communities, ecosystem, up to the higher level of biosphere. There was terms there like keystone species, intra and intra-specific, competition, pollination, ecosystem services, natural capital. The document that's online puts that in structure. It's written by the Nature Services in British Columbia for training of their local authority staff, I think it was at the time, and broader civil service. But rather than rewriting something new, that was a very good document, very much for the same target audience you are. Yeah, don't worry. When I mentioned British Columbia, we've checked it as well. You just take out that and insert the word Ireland. It's rarely used, you know. It is a really relevant document at a global level. But same, you're all coming from an agronomy, crop production, agricultural science background. There's a lot of technical terms around that. This first document just gives you like a glossary terminology that gives you the language of environmental sciences, ecology, management of these natural resources that some of you may have done, depending on what aspects of agricultural science you've already covered, may have covered already. So, but again, we just want everyone from this first section to be at least on the same page in terms of language. Okay, so I think it's important at this stage when you go away this weekend and early next week after you come back after the bank holiday weekend, to go through that document and have a clear understanding of the terminology. And if there's any problems, you can come back to us with more questions afterwards. But initially, is there any questions on that at the moment, or any issues you want to raise, or anything that just popped into your mind about it?
I suppose you mentioned there that the farmer in that case was expert, I suppose, at what she was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But how big of a challenge is it? Obviously the farmers are the important people here. From a point of view of education of them on the ecology and the results based, and how big of an effort or big of a challenge will that be? Do you see it? Or how big of a challenge was it in Leitrim, we'll say?
It wasn't that big of a challenge at all, in fairness, because once you get the terminology right, so nature, wildlife is important terminology to use instead of biodiversity. I'm using the term biodiversity with you here, and we'll use the term we're paying you for wildlife or to paying you for nature. They understand their systems, so all you're doing is slightly explaining it to them, taking the time to explain it in a slightly different way. And it's intuitive. The scoring system is actually quite intuitive. Looking between the rushes is a big challenge for farmers in Leitrim to see that there's other things there. But once they look between the rushes with somebody who said, see that, see that, see that, that's what the scoring system is paying you for. That's really easy to make a transition into understanding that that's where your payment is going. Then they have to understand how they're producing that in the first place. And as I said to them, if it's there, what you're doing already is doing the job. Maybe in the next field we need to do something a little bit different to get to that stage, but you can tell me how to best achieve it on your land. Now you see what we want to achieve. So I found it actually much easier than I thought it would be to get that message across to them.
I think the important thing when we were doing this with a lot of the farmers on the ground was again to talk in their language in particular and convert some of this complex stuff into their language. And that's what the scoring card systems try to do, but particularly the guidance should be doing, but then the advisor should be bringing them a step further. The same thing is your condition scoring animals or KEPAC wanted a certain quality of animal produced by farmers. What they do is they bring them into a show ring, and line up the different animals, the different quality standards in front of them so they could see it. I think the same thing with this. Anytime we went out we brought them to a field that is a 10 out of 10, so they could see what that 10 out of 10 is, And often I remember realised it must have been 13 years ago when we were first doing it on the common, just walking through maybe 2 kilometres of a walk with a group of farmers who were from the IFA at the time, the Irish Nature and Hill Farm Association. Some of them broke off to form that. we were trying to get it. They were saying, what's this scoring system? So I go through the scoring system, glaze over, But then as we walk through the farms, it's right. That field, that's a 2. We're walking. That one's there is a 4. That one's a 6. Then I got to one place with a 10, and then we walked on to another 6. And as we were walking, I said, call out the score. So as we were walking along those fields, there were 5, 7, 10. So there's, but then some said they get to one said 6, 7, 8, all for the same field, So they work. But then I said, right, if we go through this and I point out features I want you to look at, then they all got within one score of each other. So I think that is important thing. We're looking at the lens with this through a different lens and condition scoring it for a particular type of product. And all this comes from our understanding of all the result indicators we include in it. They are correlated with, as much as possible. The science is unsure about some of them, but we have only used certain indicators. They're simplified at the moment. We know the fields that are scoring high are going to be high in biodiversity, for example. We know the fields that are high in biodiversity and they're a particular type of habitat, peatland, that's in good condition. It's also going to be storing a lot of carbon, and based on the work that certain scientists are doing in Trinity and NUIG, David Stiles and them and John and Trinity and Maynooth as well, that we know the condition correlates with the actual soil carbon and the sequestration on them areas as well. We also know that even on mineral soils, work that's been done on semi-natural vegetation, basically comparing the Lucas data, which is a soil monitoring database from across Europe, overlaying that with Korean data, which is quite crude on semi-natural vegetation. We know that the pastures on semi-natural vegetation across Europe in general have a higher amount of carbon stored in them, even on mineral soils, than the ones that are improved agricultural grassland. This is a basic principle in ecology. The more of the dry matter that's been produced in the field that you're off-taking, put into a food product, then it's not going to be recycled back into the soil. So there are basic principles around that, and it's quite high level, So this week, first of all, it's just getting that broad understanding. Is that okay? We'll take a couple of minutes of a coffee
I would
break.
say one thing as well, that we will be concentrating on the plants because they are the plant indicators that you'll be looking at in the field. But every plant tells a story, and that's what we're trying to build up for you, is the story behind why one plant is there and another plant isn't. And that will give you a much better understanding for the scoring system and why these groupings of plants have been put there, because they are literally telling us the story of fields and the story of the management work that's gone into those fields. So that's what we want you to get from this particular session.